Welcome, everyone. My name is DJ Wells, and you've joined us once again for our weekly broadcast, Coping with COVID, where each week we discuss pressing issues that we're all facing as we continue to wrestle through this pandemic. We thank you for joining us. We see some folks starting to sign in here on the webinar. I want to remind you, as always, that this is an interactive process, and I encourage you to send in questions as those questions come up. If you're watching on a computer, on the bottom of your screen, there should be a tab that says Q&A. Click on that tab, type in your questions, and after Dr. Mensah and our guests have had a chance to chat for a little while, I'll begin to feed those questions in to our panelists. Today we have one of our Coping with COVID regulars, Ms. Maryam Tafreshi, who has been so very instrumental in helping us pull together several of these webinars. Also with us is Dr. Michael Stevens. He doesn't like us saying this, but many people refer to him as the father of international psychology. But to address his humility, we'll just say an expert in international psychology. Again, we encourage you to send in your questions. Let's just go ahead and turn this over to Dr. Mensah. Take it away, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Wells. And Dr. Stevens and Mrs. Tafreshi, we're greatly appreciative for you to spend some time sharing with us tremendous knowledge and wisdom and expertise in this field. And it's always interesting because as we're moving through the kind of climate that we're experiencing now, and I don't mean temperature, but the actual climate of the world with regard to all sorts of social and psychological challenges that stem not just from COVID, but from social unrest, all superimposed upon each other. I think it's really significant that the message that you two are going to share with us is really happening today at this time. I would say that certainly in my lifetime, and I'm not going to share with you exactly how many years that is, but in my lifetime, I've not seen so much duress, not just in this country, but in the world. Many people will talk about World War II and World War I. Well, I wasn't around for those, I'll just tell you that much. But relative to how we function and how we publicly display our emotions, our despair, our rage, this is a time where we really need to better understand really not just who we are, but what we are, and how best to move from points of challenge to points of ascendancy, moving to a higher level. So without further ado, I want to thank you, Mrs. Tafreshi and Dr. Stevens, and please share with us today.
Thank you for that very warm introduction, Mr. Wells and Dr. Mensah. It's a pleasure to be here again. Maryam, did you want to begin?
Just wanted to say thank you, and you know, we have an outline here. I think it would be, Dr. Stevens, very interesting to maybe start with why did we choose the topic we chose? For example, why are we saying self as jailer, not self as jailed? And, you know, self as liberator. And then moving forward to, you know, giving the explanation of what does self mean, and the different ways that maybe psychologists divide the self, the different parts of it, and how they're influenced. And then from there, you know, if you kindly explain that, then I can go into the two cycles of socialization and liberation.
Sure. No, that would be a good place to start. Why did we actually entitle our conversation this afternoon the way in which we did? And I think one of the things that hopefully stands out as you read the title is that there's an active component to the self. The self isn't a static construction that's been developed to characterize personality or the mind, but it rather does things as well. So it is a structure that helps us explain our identity, our roles in different situations, but the self also is very involved in sort of how we respond to different environmental conditions. And speaking of what Dr. Mensah had said at the very outset, we are living in very turbulent times. Times in which we feel, for example, with respect to COVID, we feel as though our lifestyle is restricted, we've lost our freedoms, and some of that is very true, mitigation strategies, for example. But we also perceive limitations being placed upon us that go above and beyond the kinds of mitigation strategies that have been suggested or actually mandated. So let me again just sort of summarize that the self is a structure that's been developed to try to understand the complexities of the mind, but it's also a dynamic process that can either have beneficial or problematic aspects. It can restrain us, and in other words, we can restrain ourselves, but we can also liberate ourselves by looking at things somewhat differently and making different kinds of choices with critical self-awareness. So that's one way to kind of explain the way in which we've entitled our presentation. Let me also mention that there are many different theories out there, and I'm not, obviously we don't have nearly enough time to cover even the major ones, but let me just say that when we think about the self, we really need to think for a moment about who we are in a variety of different circumstances. And when you sort of think about the roles that you play and the circumstances that you find yourself in, I think you'll quickly come to the realization that we actually have multiple selves, not just a single identity, but rather different identities that get called forth by the circumstances in which we happen to be at the time. So, for example, let's just take our role as parent, our role as professional, our role as a friend, our role as activist, and so on and so forth. And I think you can quickly realize that we don't always behave in the precise way that we would in one situation as opposed to a number of other situations. We shift gears. We reconfigure how we perceive, how we act, and how we respond to various situations. So it is an extremely complex set of selves that are interconnected and that reconfigure themselves, if I can put it that way, given the circumstances of the situations. Different kinds of memories, different kinds of rules, different kinds of patterns of behavior emerge in certain kinds of situations. And all of this happens, by the way, extremely quickly, almost involuntarily, I would say. We don't think about it, but rather we have this ability to recall successful ways that we've acquired for negotiating different kinds of circumstances. So that's just kind of a taste, if you will, of sort of how we're going to discuss today the role of self and what self is, not only in the pandemic, but also given the social unrest that we're now seeing, not just in our country, the United States, but around the world.
Dr. Stevens, would you like to also, talk about the three different parts of the self, before, again, I enter the cycle of socialization, the actual self,
Sure. Sure. Thank you for prompting me to do that. There are some theorists that, as I said before, personality psychologists to be specific, who have sort of identified a number of different selves, and there are many more than the three that Maryam had mentioned. But for example, there is the actual self, who we really are. If we take an unbiased view of who we are, that would be our real self, warts and all, positive and negative characteristics. But we also have an ideal self. And an ideal self would be those perceptions of who we are that we aspire to be, who we want to be, what we are perhaps growing into becoming. And then, of course, there is another major self called the should self, or the ought self. And this is the self that really is very rule bound, how we should behave in various situations, how we should function, operate, treat others, and so forth. So there are certain rules and regulations that govern that. And it's a somewhat more punitive, harsh, demanding self that, again, we attempt to fulfill, but not because necessarily we view that as the best or ideal self, but rather the self that we, if we don't fulfill, we're likely to experience either external or internal punishment, such as shame and guilt, or perhaps ostracism and rejection from other people.
Thank you so much. So I don't know, any questions before I start, Dr. Mensah or Mr. Wells?
No, go right ahead, actually.
Yeah,
Okay, sure.
do. And Miriam, just to let you know, I'm following your lead in terms of advancing these slides, and so I've got your first diagram up here, but please let me know as you want me to move through the slide.
Definitely, thank you so much. So this first slide, it's called the cycle of socialization. It's a brilliant work that really has inspired me throughout my international psychology education from master's level. It's by Bobby Harrow, the work of Bobby Harrow, and she has several books also. So if you look at the blue section, the circle, the beginning. So when a child is born, that child is born in a context and environment that has already had a history. It has its own rules and norms and culture, laws. The way that information is given to people, disseminated, whether fully is given to them, partially is given to them, some information is not given to them, or there are some misinformation that is given to people, whether it's to control them in order to behave in a certain way, or and maybe it's passed around conscious, not knowingly, just as a norm, it's passed around since it has been accepted. Then we have also biases, stereotypes, prejudice, histories, so traditions, values. So the child is born into this environment. And we all know that our environments can be very different from each other. So this child that, has no conscious, no sense of feeling guilty, criticized, blamed, nothing. Just this pure mind and soul is given to the parents. And if you look at the green section, the first round of socialization starts with the people that the child loves and trusts. So who are they? The parents, relatives, friends, teachers, and they're going to start to teach the child about what that child should do. What is it okay for that child to do or not to do, the values, beliefs, whether it's cultural, religious, social norms. These are going to be enforced at this level. And then all of this is going to be reinforced as a second section, which it's going to be the yellow circle that you see. All these values and beliefs are going to be reinforced whether by culture, when the child goes outside and the society, the cultural practices, traditions, the songs they sing, language that is used, or institutions, again, whether religious, spiritual institutions, schools, the media, the legal system, how they reinforce. And consciously, unconsciously, the child will start to pick these up. So these are the cultural and institutional socializations. And so the third set of enforcement is whether the child, or that is now a grown up, actually, since the time that child, enters the society, this socialization is going to be enforced by rewards or punishment. So you either listen to B or you don't listen to B, and the child is going to decide, as Dr. Stevens mentioned, it's the self that is going to decide, is it better for me to listen, not to listen? Do I really want to listen or not to listen? What are the risks? What is the benefit? And from here, either those information that are given, values, norms, either are going to empower the person, or some of it might be privileging a group, oppressing another group, discriminating a group. Some people might be ostracized, persecuted, stigmatized. And what happens? Then we move on to the red section. As a result, either those people will start to internalize everything that they believed, whether it's of benefit to them or not, or of benefit to others or not. And then for some people might choose, based on that, I'm going to go silent. Some might start feeling angry, dehumanized, feel guilty, be ignorant, find it actually it's going to work for them. And then we move on to the purple section, that either people are going to say, you know what, this is either kind of working for me, or it's not working for me, but I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm not going to make any waves. I don't want to lose my privileges, or I don't want to be somebody that now it's going to become an outsider. So I'm going to promote the status quo because it's either benefiting me or it's just safer. It's just safer to be where I am. So then that person also starts, promoting that cycle. Or the person starts to say, you know what, I just can't take this, whether I'm I am being privileged by that, but I'm not going to accept this because of either some parts of it is not right for me, or some parts of it are right not for others, or the other people who feel, really they're being marginalized or oppressed. They're going to say, you know what, we're going to just go against the status quo. We want change. They're going to start to educate themselves, or they're going to question what all the norms and beliefs, and really start to see, is that something they believe? Which ones do they believe? Which ones are empowering to them and others, or just for them and others? And which part is it that really it's becoming dysfunctional and just crashing them or others? And that's where the direction for change starts. So this is about and again, the core, if you look, this is a very interesting, the core of a person that stays there, if the cycle of socialization, a part of it can be positive, which is, for example, when we learn about these values, whether, let's say they're cultural or, through the institutions, some of it is really trying to bring harmony. So all the people kind of can expect what other people will do. So it takes that anxiety of away from people, of the unknown, but some of it really is not good. So it can create a core that has fear. There's ignorance, confusion, and a sense of insecurity within that part of the identity of the person. If any comments, Dr. Stevens or
well,
Dr. Mensah?
thank you for. I would add just one small point, and then when you talk about how the learning that takes place for a young child, typically from a caregiver, and then messages that reinforce that from society, all of these are, as you point out so well, are internalized, and so we regulate ourselves. but not necessarily in a way that's going to enhance who we are. We actually become our own jailers. And in the words of liberation psychologists, we participate in our own oppression because we maintain some of these very strict rules and guidelines about how we should be in the world, which do not necessarily reflect our potentialities and who we are. And sometimes they are simple rules that we hear from significant others who we look up to and who we expect to be our caregivers and who provide love and security. And a perfect example of this is, boys should not cry. Or it's a sin to be angry. Or something along those lines. And soon men suppress their feelings of hurt and pain. And there's a whole bunch of medical and psychological consequences to that for men. Or we tend to view ourselves as bad people, children particularly, simply because we're experiencing a normal human emotion of anger. And we do that to ourselves. And so the key here is to somehow recognize that a seemingly acceptable situation is truly problematic. How do we create that level of self-awareness and consciousness? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, of course. But that's the whole idea of self as jailer in a nutshell.
I think that's amazingly important. What so many people don't realize is that sometimes they really do hinder their own progress and own mental well-being by the list, the set of rules that they've generated over a lifetime, whether it's been from institutions or families, as you just pointed out, Dr. Stevens, or whether it's been through their own assessment of what has to be in place, what has to be in order for them to function. And they can literally create so many boundaries of what we would call the I can't list or I can't do, that they find themselves stuck and depressed, anxious, and fearful because everywhere they turn, they've boxed themselves in. I think that's very, very important. And I thank both of you for bringing that up and kind of sharing how deep this goes. I mean, ultimately to the time we're born, all the way through adulthood, everything from socialization to our own perspectives on living and well-being come to bear to put us in that prison. And we're looking very well forward to the next section here on how do we get out.
Well, and before we do move on to that, I have a question that's come in here that I think is quite appropriate given the conversation, and specifically given Miriam's conversations about socialization and our first socialization. And the question that's come in is asked, are we really regulating ourselves, or are we regulated by where we grew up? You know, perhaps we grew up in a racist area or in a racist family. You know, so are we regulated by those things that we were taught when we were young and those who taught us when we were young? How do we reconcile that?
Dr. Stevens, would you like to, because I think it's
Sure.
two forces going back and forth.
Well, I would say both are true. It's not either or. It's a process, as Maryam said in the beginning, we're born a blank slate, and we are educated to view people with different colored skin, for example, in certain ways. We then internalize that. It becomes part of who we are, part of how we see the world. And we tend to confirm that by maintaining that view, supporting that view, because one of the sad things about the self as jailer is that we seek confirming information. We don't seek contradictory information. We seek confirming or verifying information because it makes us feel more secure, more stable. So it's very difficult to break through, let's take prejudice and racist views. It's very difficult to do that because you're challenging someone to view the world differently. And when you give up the way that you viewed the world for so many years, it creates confusion and uncertainty and disequilibrium. And people don't like that. People do not like to feel that the way they've seen the world for years and years and years just doesn't work anymore. No one wants to feel that way. So we actually seek confirming information to further support erroneous and harmful views that we have of the world and ways in which we, in fact, interact in that world.
And as we talk, Dr. Stevens, one reason is because it's about the identity that we have shaped, and there's this human need to kind of keep that identity the same it is, whether it's functional or not functional, until somebody feels, this is really not working and they decide to change. But that doesn't mean once they go through the process of change, it's not going to be painful, because they have to kind of break a part of that identity they have,
right,
and then remold a new one.
Right.
And all of a sudden in front of you, you have to accept some of that reality and norms and values and principles and beliefs that they have told you. It's like, wow, this was a lie. I was misinformed. I believed in this. I pushed it. So the other people were correct. So all this confusion goes, it can be a grieving process.
Yes.
So it takes a lot of courage. And also, what are the basic principles of that person? To what level of awareness is that person? So that finally that person wants to change. Is that person ready? And again, Dr. Stevens later, I think, would talk about, the change process. How could it be difficult? How could it be easy? How can psychologists help with that?
Mm-hmm.
But one thing I would like to add here, as Dr. Stevens mentioned, we have different selves. For example, in this cycle, also we are taught through our culture and the environment we are about how we should feel, what should we believe, and about different parts of ourselves, about gender. How should we think about gender? Which gender is more valuable or not? How should each gender behave? What is the role of each gender? And if you kind of come outside that, you might be, shocking to people, or, it might be punishing, or people don't want to be with you, or what is the sexual orientation of that person? What is the race of that person? What is the ethnicity or nationality of that person? And we know that, there's a knowledge within, let's say, politicians. They know how to work with fear. There's a theory called the terror theory. They try to use fear because it's the most basic part of a human being that, is for survival. You create fear about, somebody is an enemy, or this one is not good and we are the better. And all of a sudden that sense of identity they're trying to confirm within us, socialize us, it just becomes more confirmed. And another thing in developmental psychologists, I remember I was reading, it was mentioning, the one way to control people is telling them whatever is being told to say, this is a moral value, even if it's not. And you say, you don't do that, I'm going to punish you. You do, you're going to follow what I tell you, you're going to be privileged, or you're going to be, prized by something. So internalization and socialization, it actually helps the people who want to control others if it's used in that negative, manipulative way. What's better? Let's say we have let's say in the society, if we want to control everybody, that's going to take a lot of energy and money, rather than trying to instill all this belief inside somebody so they control themselves with guilt, with shame, with, all those conflicts within. So anything else any of you would you like to add, or do you want us to move to the liberation cycle?
Let's talk about freeing ourselves from these confines.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So again, this cycle is liberation cycle is based on the work of Bobby Harris still. If you look at the yellow section on the left up, it says waking up. So as we talked, the people who were, thinking, what, I'm not going to go by the status quo. I'm going to start questioning it. This is the time that a person has woken up. And what do they try to do? If you, they try to get ready. If you see in the light green section, they try to empower themselves by educating themselves, by raising their self-awareness, social awareness, by trying to, just dismantle privileges, or internalizations that are very oppressive. They try to analyze things and understand it and learn about different tools to use in order to move forward, which is, creating a core. If you see intrapersonal, creating a core that is different, which again, at the center when you see, it changes into self-love, self-esteem, balance, joy, support, security. This is a healthy self. So this person then, we at the reaching out, the orange section starts to move out from him or herself to others, reaching to others, and tries to experience and explore things, taking some risk, making a stand, not gonna go quiet anymore. And then from there, you see the interpersonal, all these changes within, and questioning now is going to change how that person views the world and others. How is that person is going to value others? The value that person had towards somebody that was very high and idealized, and now it's going to change. Am I going to distance myself a little bit? Am I going to cut some of these relationships? Am I going to make different relationships that, match my principles or who I am, who has grown up? So then the person then might move forward towards building a community. So here the person can start reaching to others and working with people who are like-minded, that support each other, but also make coalition with people that are different from them in order to create change. Challenging the norms and systems and rules that are dysfunctional, for many people. And then it moves towards the next section of now trying to educate others, and not to take privilege. And then moving into action, trying to create action. And then in the blue section, if you see, that person might start to be a role model, take a leadership stand, and really try to now systematically introduce and change, the policies, the assumptions, the structures, and also that such a person has the ability to share power. Because again, if all of that, was for, understanding that the power was over them, if they start to overpower everybody, they're going to go back to the cycle that, negative cycle that we just talked about. So as you see, this is a systematic change. If we can go to the next slide. So I just wrote down here the different cores, self as jailer, again, the difference between that with self as liberator. So this is an identity. Where do we want to be? Where are we? And it, and we can have a little bit of a mix of all. It doesn't mean that in different situation or different identity that we have, we're just fearful all the time. No, we can be empowered. I'm doing the empowerment research, and the results is just fascinating. As international psychologists, we have to do the research at an individual level, family level, social level, in the larger context of a country. And it was so interesting to see how some women can be very empowered at an individual, family level, even work level, but not feeling empowered at a bigger, larger level of their country, feeling so disempowered, and how they try to manage that and pursue that. Any question? Did we lose Dr. Stevens or?
I think we're all still here. Dr. Stevens, anything you want to share or add? Oh, perhaps you did. Is that the last slide, Miriam, other than?
You know, this is for the talking. Later we have what we, you know, introducing ourselves, the work
Sure.
of Dr.
Sure.
Stevens. But any questions that might be here? I'm gonna put I put my cell phone on. I'm gonna see if Dr. Stevens is trying to contact us.
Okay, well, if he comes back in, then we should have no problem getting him back on the broadcast. Dr. Mensah, do you have any questions or comments here?
Certainly. Maryam, Mrs. Tafreshi, you know, it's fascinating when we talk about the idea of the ignorance piece. In life, everything we do as children moving through the process of growth into adulthood involves taking on new ideas, new experiences in order to fully develop. Yet we get to this stage we call supposedly adulthood, and all of our biases, all our constructs are now held in, and many of us choose not to continue the process that got us where we were in the first place, growth and evolution. And that's what keeps us in a cycle of functional ignorance, because we're not able to move beyond all of those social and psychological parameters that led us to this particular point, and we stay there. And then we begin to, as you say, we begin to seek information, actually, as Dr. Stevens said, we begin to seek information that holds us in that place, as though there's nowhere else to go. And that becomes a very, very huge impediment to what is and should be a process of ongoing growth up until the day we perish, really. So herein is something that the two of you brought up that is amazingly key in evaluation, understanding, and permission for moving beyond and growing. And in that gives us the capacity to join with others, to explore, and to build those bonds and to build those points of debunking myths and sharing new experiences that are really joyful and intriguing. So it's very interesting that you talked about in that, I think it was the blue square, the ignorance factor, because as opposed to how we're really designed, that's where we tend to want to settle, Miriam, as you talked about the idea of fear, to find out differently than what we've already come to understand and how we've been groomed, so to speak. So I think those are very, very valuable points that many of us really don't think about. We get comfortable in our place. And one of our scientific mentors said, you know, if we consider ourselves to be real scientists, we have to be willing to throw away our most cherished beliefs when presented with information that is diametrically opposed but found to be true. If we in medicine, we in science, used the same kind of challenging boxed in paradigms that we do in social psychological dynamics, we wouldn't be anywhere. We'd all be saying the world is flat. We'd all be saying that there's no such thing as bacteria. And we'd all be saying that there's no way to go beyond treatment of conditions like autism or anxiety or depression at a molecular level. In other words, science mandates exactly what you guys are talking about, which is that willingness to go beyond certain paradigms that we've been inundated with, I should say inundated with, but utilize as foundational growth parameters for us in exploration of science and new methodologies. We have to do that. Otherwise, we lag behind. Many of our listeners, as you pointed out, Mrs. Tafreshi, are sitting there with empowerment at one level in this social dynamic. but are frozen in other levels. They are, we call them warrior moms, warrior dads, who are looking at any kind of alternative methodology, any kind of methodology to help their children and families. But in another place, another point in the social dynamic, they're frozen and incapacitated. They may not be able to move beyond certain parameters of their own. Dr. Stevens.
My apologies, we had a power outage, and so I needed everything to sort of get restored. I wanted to follow up, Dr. Mensah, on your comment about medicine and science. There was a well-known psychologist, George Kelly, who actually referred to people as scientists, person as scientist. And
Yes.
in essence, we are designed, we function implicitly in this regard, that we develop theories, we have hypotheses, we test them out, we confirm or reject them, we take the results, and we inform ourselves. But that requires that there's some permeability in who we are as human beings, that we're willing to undertake the process of sort of an inflow of contradictory information and use that to modify the way in which we see the world and the way in which we operate. And in much the same way as professional scientists do. But it's not an easy process to give up some cherished perspective. And I've seen this even among professionals too. But certainly for people where there's really no pressure to give that up, it becomes, people resist change. And this is true in almost all different forms of psychotherapy. And the challenge really is to not, in my own professional view, to not directly confront or attack the resistance, but to rather work through it in a supportive way where one tries to minimize the defensiveness, to allow the person then to at least try on for size a different perspective, different information, in order to liberate themselves to live a more meaningful and fulfilling life.
If I can offer yet another paradigm to look at this, my own work as a writing instructor for several years, one of the things that I often tell my own students is that the greatest impediment to creativity, to doing something that is truly creative in your writing, in your academic thinking, are those barriers that we place upon ourselves, those things where we tell ourselves everyone else is going to think this is a dumb idea. And so often creative thought and creative advancement is hindered by folks talking themselves out of those creative ideas initially. And I think a lot of what we're discussing today kind of gets at that notion.
The power to be imperfect, the power to make mistakes, the power to learn from experience. Those are very challenging things, particularly for students who are being evaluated. So there's an expectation, well, I'm going to have to turn in something that's going to impress Mr. Wells. How can I allow myself, how can I liberate myself just to go through this process and see where it takes me?
I think it needs a trusting place. For example, I can see that through my education at TCSPP, we had to read a lot, and then we had discussions, weekly discussions, and from Wednesdays to Sundays, we had to be engaged. So there were always, educators were saying, critical thinking, connect your thoughts with whatever you have read. And, you can connect it to experiences. So I personally, remember, I wouldn't share much, very cautious, because I wanted to see how safe the place it is, who thinks what. But the more I saw the educators were encouraging, the more I saw actually, while they were opening up the platform for everybody to critically think and share. And we're taught to talk in a respectful way, even if we don't accept each other's views, but the way we have to question and everything. So it makes us think deeper about something and grow together. So the more I saw that, and how even educators would come out in front of some of the students that maybe didn't use a very professional language towards somebody, because all of a sudden some of their beliefs got attacked, they felt this person is being very biased, while that person wasn't. It opened this trust, let's say, for me, and I know for many students, to even talk further and further and further. So if we can create such a place, or even if we have a person that we can kind of not only alone self-reflect, but have the other reflection and grow together, that would definitely be ideal.
Dr. Stevens and Mrs. Tafreshi, how do we move through that space? How do we, that point, how do we undo these challenges of bias, and how do we get out of the cage? How do we get out of the cage?
A lot of different ways of doing that. And fundamentally, I think it involves expanding our horizons. And so we can do that through therapy, of course. We could do that outside of therapy. I think one of the wonderful things that we have now is that there's so many examples out there of individuals who share their life journey, in which they have managed to overcome the barriers that have jailed them and have liberated themselves and embraced a different perspective that has made their life fulfilling. You see this all the time in high school when kids are brought back, recent graduates who have been brought back, and sort of talk about their experiences dealing with drugs or whatever else it might be, the difficulties and challenges of being a teen. And they share their experience, and they become models, very realistic models, for a process that so many others are struggling with, that they can recognize in this person's story. So I think that conversation that Maryam was talking about becomes very, very important, to have a peer mentor, as an example. And many schools are sort of doing this. Even at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, we try to match more advanced students with beginning students because they're more credible. They've been through it. And so this process of critical self-reflection, and how do you do that in a way that minimizes defensiveness? So I think that's one way we can accomplish this. Peer modeling, mentoring. There's a great therapy that I've used a lot that I like, and it goes back to this fellow George Kelly that I mentioned before, who coined the term person as scientist. He developed a therapy called fixed role therapy, and the therapist and the client basically create a script, and the script basically says, how would you be functioning in the world if you felt confident? Or if you embraced people of different races and religions and so forth, what would it look like to kind of see you in action? And it's just a script. You don't have to be that way, but let's try it. Let's try it out for size. Come back next week and tell me what your experiences were. And what it does is, in a safe way, because it is a script, and we're play acting, we still accumulate very different experiences. So this young person who may have a host of prejudices, one of the tasks might be to make eye contact with an African American, for example, and just greet that person with how you doing, or hi, and then report back the next week, starting small, building some of those successes into more elaborate type interactions. When we actually open up our experience and get beyond stereotypes or with the images that we see through the media or the upbringing that we've had, if we have our own experience inflowing, we're in a better position to really challenge some of those so-called truths that we've been living with for so long. It's the same thing with COVID. I mean, I know we haven't talked a whole lot about that today, but one of the things we know is that people feel that their rights are being infringed upon, that they're not free anymore because they have to wear masks or observe social distancing. And in fact, I certainly can understand that point of view. But how can you, given the restrictions, experience as much freedom as you possibly can have to socialize, to be with people, to enjoy life as much as you possibly did prior to COVID? And so you do basically an experiment. Given COVID, how would you function if you were maximally free while still observing social mitigation rules and regulations? And I think a person might be willing to experiment a little bit and discover that maybe there are more freedoms still available to that person to live their life in the way that they have enjoyed, but feel that they're no longer able to. There's a lot more freedom there than people recognize.
Indeed, but there's also a hierarchy of freedom. You get to certain points where freedoms start to collide. Okay,
Sure.
I'm free to do this, but if it inhibits your freedom, then I can't really do that because that conflicts with the whole idea of freedom in general. So with COVID, what I think quite a few of us don't really consider is that the ultimate hierarchy of freedom rests in the freedom to be alive and healthy, and that all other activities that would impede that ultimate freedom to sustain life have to come secondary.
Sure.
Okay? Because otherwise, if you're not here, if your loved one's not here, then there's no question about your freedom. You've got
Absolutely.
the ultimate freedom, which is non-existence on this level. Okay?
Right.
All religious perspectives aside. So
Sure.
when we look at that hierarchy of freedoms, it's really what you're saying here. What can you do that gives you freedom, that allows you to display your freedom, that doesn't impede on that ultimate goal of the dominant freedom, the total freedom for everyone? And I think folks have got to kind of reevaluate what freedom means. Freedom doesn't mean that you get to act the way you want to act recklessly if it's going to hurt or impede the greater population at large. So yes, people have the freedom, for example, and I'm not trying to get political here, but to carry weapons. People have the freedom to shoot to kill, but there are consequences to shooting and killing based upon your freedom. So is it a wise thing to act on that freedom, or is it not wise? So we're not children where they run around unmitigatedly doing whatever it is they want to do because they don't know any better. We also have to exercise wisdom with that freedom.
Right.
And the idea is not you're sequestered. The idea is that for a time you are minimizing certain freedoms in order to optimize the ultimate freedom. And there's got to be wisdom that goes along with that so that you can go back to the total gain that you're looking for in the first place, which is the restoration of normalcy. So when we start talking about things in that fashion, we go back to the idea that both you and Mrs. Tafreshi brought up of jailing ourselves once again. And now we want to break out of those prisons, but not in an appropriate or structural way. So I think there's some very interesting things that actually apply to the whole COVID situation here as well, in terms of behavior and perceptions.
I'd like to add here, just as a reminder, for our audience, that as I mentioned, culture, which then, the norms and values, which then a lot of times creates the laws and rules, and they can affect each other. Then the laws and rules, that later come that somebody enforces can change some cultural norms within a society. But the reason they are created, the most basic part is survival within the region and the conditions that exist, whether it's economy, it's nature, it's the politics, whatever it is, it's for the survival of everybody. And we're social, we're social human beings, we're not living in isolation. So as you mentioned, there is going to be a limit so everybody can survive. And then we have to understand our condition is not the same. There's a crisis. Something is different. So again, some of the rules and regulations are going to change. Why? Because again, our main goal, as always, for the culture, for the norms, for the rules, for the laws, was survival. So we can survive. So we're not going to say we're going to do the same thing, but you know what? There's a disaster outside. Like if there's a tornado, is somebody going to say, I'm just going to go outside because I want freedom? No, you're not going to do that. You're going to go hide somewhere. So this is kind of the same thing, trying to adjust till hopefully, either the situation is gone and we can cope with it. Either we go back or we have a new normal, or some things are going to change, which I think some things will change even if COVID disappears, let's say. So that's one thing I think is a good reminder that maybe allows us to embrace the change that is here instead of fighting it and getting angry. Start to create a new norm.
Maryam, that's
one of the, I'm sorry.
The point that you just brought up, many of us really just gloss over. We're trying to superimpose our traditional freedoms as though there's no new circumstance or condition that would mitigate some of those. You're absolutely right. This is not the old norm where everything is basic and there are no consequences, no disease, no challenge. This is a new framework in which we have to exist in our lives and share that framework with others around us. We have to realize it's not about our old freedoms. The question is really, what are our new freedoms that allow things to flow properly? And some of those mean compromise. Mr. Wells, I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
I was simply going to point out another point that Maryam and Dr. Stevens have made in past visits with us, and that is the collectivist versus the individualistic nature of the different cultures. And oftentimes, as we wrestle with these freedoms, as we challenge these freedoms, it's based on our cultural perspective, and some cultures are just more naturally adept at doing things that benefit the greater good than our other cultures.
Absolutely. And you can actually see that in terms of the degree to which the general populations of individualistic nations versus collectivistic nations adhere to social mitigation policies and practices. And it can be quite startling to see that difference. The other thing that we're facing, and I'll just share where I live in a town of about 175,000 in central Illinois, and we're experiencing a huge surge in cases. We live in a university town, and I would say the other day we had 99 cases, 90 of which ranged in the age range between 18 and 29. And day after day, it's primarily college kids, high school kids. They are not concerned about their health. They are immortal. I was immortal once. I smoked, drank, not excessively, but, we were all in college at one point, so you know what I'm saying. How do we persuade younger people who are very invested in their peers, in their social groups, to recognize the new normal, if you will? I don't particularly care for that phrase, but it's become part of our lexicon. How do we help them become aware that health is a freedom when it's sort of assumed that it's a non-issue at that particular age? And here again, I would say just one example would be public service announcements, which I haven't seen. I have not seen public service announcements reaching out to young people who, and I may be mistaken, and I mean no offense, may be less inclined to adhere to wearing a mask or maintaining social distance. Can we find models, people who have a different story about what their life, how their life changed because they fell ill or may have infected loved ones who fell ill, and maybe seriously so. I haven't seen that kind of public service announcement to challenge the belief that, okay, I'm immortal and I do not need to take into consideration health because that's a guaranteed freedom. Therefore, I can do whatever I want to do because my health is not at stake.
That's a very interesting point. Something that I've noticed recently and had a conversation with others about is when the social justice crisis first hit this country, we began to see several celebrities, several networks, lots of television networks doing regular public service announcements about the need to come together, the need to heal, the need to address social justice concerns. We never really saw that with the pandemic. We never saw celebrities coming out and saying, hey, just stay home and wear your mask for a while. There hasn't been that same kind of energy. There has been some, but certainly not to the same extent.
There have been discussions in the news and about cases and individuals telling their stories, very telling of individuals who did not believe this to be real. In fact, just yesterday, literally, there's a story where a man who is I believe in his 50s or so, buried his wife of X number of years because both of them got COVID and both of them were in the hospital. He survived, she died. Their stories are relative to similar kind of scenarios for those in the 20s, but there's not enough, you're right, there's not enough dissemination, there's not enough publicity directed towards the teens with regard to that and the young folks in college. And as Dr. Stevens said, indeed, remember those days, we were all wearing S's on our chests and flew from place to place. We didn't walk, we levitated. We're all super beings back in those days. But it's very critical for them to understand that what they share, what they can acquire, in the best case scenario, might just make them sick. But what they don't realize is that in a worst case scenario, there can be prolonged neurological effects and things like that. And so we really do need to increase targeting our media directions towards the teenagers. Both Mr. Wells and Dr. Stevens, I agree with you, in other words, we're not doing enough to let teens know in their own way, something that would affect them, that this is a real important situation that they've got to realize can affect them. Maybe not necessarily so much so in terms of death, but there are definitely consequences neurologically, physiologically, and in several different ways as well.
I like to add, as we're talking about students, let's say being in college, university, they want to go, okay, it's okay, but they're partying. And some reasonings they start to bring us like, it's my last year, it's my, first year, or, oh, it's just university time, it's fun time, I don't want to miss this time. So I think besides what Dr. Stevens says, the way to that health is freedom is to let them know this is not the only time of their life that they're going to experience joy. They're like 18, 20, 21. They have a long life in front of them to go party with their friends and have fun and have adventure, explore. So the decision they're making, if they're not going to be careful, or if they're going to be around people who are not going to be careful, and it's going to affect them. And as you said, we don't know who's going to get it, who's not going to get it, to what extent they're going to get it. Is it worth it? Is it worth it just because of this few months? Because some universities are open only from, like, let's say end of August or beginning of September till November. And so I personally don't understand that part. It's like, if it's safe, why not be open the whole time? But just for a few months, or just for 1 year, or till, hopefully we know how to deal with this, our immune system, we understand how to deal with this. And then we can enjoy another 60, 70 years forward. So maybe this is some of the messages we need to give them, so they start to think differently. I wanted to ask Dr. Stevens, I think, would you be able to talk about liberation psychology? Because Dr. Mensah was asking about, if we can give our audience some tools, and you did mention about role models. You did mention about mentors, which also all of this came in my empowerment work. But also in your book that later will show the audience, you mentioned about self-awareness, social awareness, which I think it starts with questioning. So there are some pointers you have in liberation psychology that I thought it's going to be very useful, every 3 part of it, if you can please share with us.
Yeah, liberation psychology really is not so much related to the concept of self, although it is somewhat indirectly, but it's really more speaking about social change on a larger scale. An example would be poverty. And one of the problems with poverty is that if there's generation after generation of people who are born to live through and pass along impoverished lives down through the generations, you sort of accept that situation as normal, right? Drinking water that's terribly polluted and unhealthy, for example. So one of the things and this is a perspective that really emerged in Latin America, is that there's an initial process of that's called problematization. And essentially what that means is somehow recognizing, usually through some kind of group process, that something that is problematic or that has been accepted as sort of a normal, natural situation is in fact problematic. And a lot of the research that's carried out shows that you can do that by bringing people together to kind of speak about their circumstances openly and honestly and with some support, gently prompting them to examine the circumstances of their lives and whether these truly are the way things are supposed to be, or whether they are in fact problematic. A process develops subsequent to that where people become aware that there are other people like them who are suffering through circumstances that they once believed were acceptable, but now are beginning to question as being problems that need to be changed, maybe through activism of some sort. And they begin to develop this capacity for critical thinking and even some sense of personal empowerment in implementing some changes to their situation at the grassroots level. And then, of course, the third stage of this is called de-ideologizing, where people reach the point where they begin to question what they've been told by their parents, by society, by institutions, that this is the way it's supposed to be. For example, social Darwinism. You're poor because you're not capable genetically of rising out of poverty, okay? You're a woman so that you have no right to assume positions of authority in society. That's not what women do. That's not what God said women should do. You begin to question some of these messages. You kind of deconstruct the narrative that has oppressed you, that you've internalized, and that you continue to use in oppressing yourself. You throw that off. And it's a very difficult process because if you're doing it alone, just imagine how earth-shattering that would be. So it's important for people in like situations to be together in this process, and perhaps to be guided by some who have developed that greater critical self-awareness and a sense that they can assume greater power over their own lives. In other words, to be liberated from the jail that they have been put in and that they themselves have participated in.
Dr. Stevens, you said this now. I'm laughing because of, I wanted to say as international psychologists, when we really believe in what we do and the principles. We were talking, we don't talk the talk, we walk the walk.
Right.
So I thought this was interesting to say, actually, if whoever, people who saw the advertisement, there's a reason behind why we put our photos side by side rather than the norm of, a mentor with a PhD, an expert to have a photo up and the PhD candidate or student to be have the photo under. And also, on the first PowerPoint, I put your name first, and you mentioned that I put my name. So we wanted to actually, prior to starting this talk, kind of do what we are talking and teaching today or introducing. So we wanted to break the status quo, and we decided that since this is a collaborative work and we're bringing equal amount of information and work, we decided to put our photos side by side. And Dr. Stevens was actually very generous. He was telling me, actually, no, you put your photo first and your name first. Culturally, I'm still not at that level of accepting that change, but at least I accepted to put my name in the front on the PowerPoint, because he was mentioning, you're the one who came with this vision on what to do, and so let's do it that way. And I'm glad we did this as.
But it's getting easier, isn't it?
It is, and I'm thankful. Actually, I had this twist in my stomach, and I want to share this for our viewers. I had this twist in my stomach. It's like, oh man, culturally, my mentor, I can't do that. I can accept side by side, but not have my name in front or my photo on top. But I said, you know what? This is the right thing. I'm doing empowerment research. This is what we're teaching. I'm going to accept that challenge. I'm going to accept that twist within. And so kind of, I hope that, whoever wants to go through this challenge accepts that there's going to be some discomfort, and that is okay, because there's a beauty that comes after it. And once you're empowered, as my empowerment research has been showing, you get to a different level of empowerment. And which is, you just grow more and more. You fall into this cycle of positivity, becoming more empowered.
Let's empower some of our folks who might be listening to ask questions at this juncture. I thank you both for a wonderful, tremendous discussion. Mr. Wells, do we have any folks who've asked any questions?
Actually, I was able to work in a couple of the questions as they came in. And the only other question we have, just as it came in, Dr. Stevens answered it. And that was one that was speaking to the social justice climate and how we reconcile people who may have been taught something different, but now are faced with a world that's saying that we do need to pay attention to social justice. And Dr. Stevens, you did speak to this notion of challenging those conceptions ourselves and experimenting and that type of thing. So I think we're pretty much good in terms of the questions that have come in, and this has been just such a rich and enlightening discussion. And thank you so much for sharing with us today. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
And Miriam, if you would be so kind, I know that we're going to kind of take this discussion another step further in a couple of weeks. If you could kind of describe the other guests that you're bringing to us in a couple of weeks' time.
Yes, so in 2 weeks, we're going to have on the second section of Empowered, calling Empowered, and then followed by Meaning Making. So Dr. Adu, who is an expert methodologist, he is my methodologist, and we're going to talk about the method that actually as phenomenological and meaning making and the different steps we use. Give those, I felt that those are wonderful tools that not only researchers can use, but people can use in order to navigate their life and maybe change, kind of question the meanings they give to some definitions and then move forward.
Absolutely. And Miriam, I'll share that you and I have had some very interesting conversations about how different words and different ideas hold different meanings for different people. And
That's
so
correct.
being able to reconcile that really helps us navigate life going forward. Dr. Mensah, any final comments or bits of wisdom that you want to share before we sign off for today?
More so constructs of humility. I want to thank both Maryam Tafreshi and Dr. Stevens. And I have to say, I think that our conversation today leads way to, yet I don't want to intrude on your time, but I think it would be fabulous if we could have at some point a discussion about moving through that, breaking the walls. There's so much there in
Yes.
Escape Page that we would certainly love to have a conversation with the two of you again, specifically focusing on different pathways. You know, certainly as an educator, Dr. Stevens, this is what you do all the time in terms of helping individuals move through this process academically and through your work as a psychologist. Maryam, you are in a very interesting place because you have two cages that were brought to you. One being culture and the other one being your designation as a female. We all have multiple cages, by the way, all of us do. But what's intriguing is how you've moved through the process of breaking through certain cages to allow yourself to gain the information to move forward, to grow, and to help educate others and help others break through these cages. So I would certainly like to have the two of you back to talk through these processes that you've gone through individually and together. And so that invitation is always open when you've got the time. When you've got the time.
Absolutely. It would be a pleasure, Dr. Mensah.
Mr. Wells, can we show the slide that
Absolutely.
has the information of Dr. Stevens and the books, because those are extremely valuable books. I have to say that our education and international psychology, the knowledge that Dr. Stevens has and the books he has written, just right now I have all of your books, Dr. Stevens, and so on the side, using them in my dissertation. So if you want to explain anything about them, or
They're good books. Not the most exciting, but they are informative, and I do appreciate what you said, Maryam, very much. Thank you, and I'm glad you found them helpful in your research.
Thank you.
Very good. And let's also share Miriam's your information, your contact information. So as folks who are watching us today and watching the video replay of this down the road, as they have further questions, I'm assuming that they can reach out to you for further discussion.
Thank you so much.
And we want to, of course, thank all of you who have taken the time to join us today, to participate in this discussion, both by way of asking questions or just sitting in and listening. And we encourage you, as we always do, we will have a video link of the recording of this webinar available on the Mensah Medical YouTube channel later on this evening. We'll have links to it on our Facebook page as well. So if you want to go back and look at those slides that Maryam and that Dr. Stevens provided to us before, or if you want to make sure you've got the names of Dr. Stevens' books so that you can go out and get them, go back and look at that video and relive some of this impressive conversation that we've had today. And we encourage you to let your friends and family know as well, your friends, your family, your colleagues. Let them know that this will be available to them via YouTube and Facebook and the like. And with that, we encourage you to join us again in 2 weeks. We will likely be with you again next week as well, and we'll announce on Monday what those topics will be. But please do keep your eyes and ears open on Facebook for further information about our programs going forward. Thank you again, everyone, for being with us, and Thank you, Dr. Stevens. Thank you, Maryam, for your time today. Dr. Mensah, thank you as always.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
My pleasure.